In my opinion, 2017 was one of the best years for video games in the recent decade. Nintendo absolutely knocked it out of the park with Super Mario Odyssey and Breath of the Wild on their revolutionary new console, the Nintendo Switch. Cuphead was a nice change of pace with great art and music, and it was hard as well. Well, it was much harder for some people at least. Persona 5 was a huge hit and maybe my favorite JRPG that I played, but I think a game nobody saw coming and nobody had on their best video games of 2017 list is Hollow Knight. Hollow Knight is an indie Metroidvania, and if you don't know what Metroidvania is, it's a game constructed and designed similar to an SNES title called Super Metroid. Hollow Knight was also made by a 3-person team called Team Cherry. Yeah, 3 people made this. It's absolutely ridiculous. And on the other hand, a whole studio made this. Really makes you think, huh? When you boot up Hollow Knight for the first time, you are greeted by this lovely art style that captures you immediately in the world of Hallownest. I love the home screen and the save slots. It all has a beautiful charm to it and definitely has the same mood as the game. As soon as you get to the first town, you feel the uneasy atmosphere of the game. You sense that something is wrong and that something shouldn't be like the way it is. More and more as you play the game, you explore the ruins of the fallen kingdom. Its residents are now just husks. They are hollow. But this kingdom hasn't always been this way, no. You learn this by exploring the huge kingdom Hallownest, and the player in this game doesn't get the lore immediately shoved in his face. It isn't something like Legend of Zelda or Mario that just tells you immediately what happened. And you can even miss the lore completely in this game if that's your thing for some reason. Hollow Knight is very different in the way that the player actually has to work for the story of the game. And I don't mean this in a way that as the player plays more of the game, he uncovers more of the story. No, you will encounter many NPCs that tell you what happened. You have these stone plates that have some information written on them, buildings and statues like the huge one in the City of Tears that show off the architecture and the power of a kingdom in its peak. The game tells you the story without telling it. I think the best example of this you actually have to work for the story thing is the Dung Defender. Dung Defender is a boss, and after a very fun fight, the player, if he's careful enough, can find his den in which he's sleeping. You can enter his dream using the Dream Nail, and after beating the White Defender 5 times, not only with every defeat is there some text regarding the story, but the Dung Defender will wake up and tell you some information. The game doesn't force the player to uncover the lore and the story of what happened and why is this kingdom in the state that it is. You can even beat it without uncovering anything. The game gambles with the story, and this works because it's interesting and the player will explore it because you want to know why is the infection here and you want to know how to stop it. The game, the setting, the kingdom of Hallownest, everything is so interesting and the player will be curious and he will want to uncover the story just because it interests him so much. Sometimes it isn't the story that it's told that captures the player, but the way that story is told. And that definitely stands for Hollow Knight. The lore is magical, complicated but interesting. In Hollow Knight you play as just another vessel, but with a goal the previous one didn't fulfill. Vessels are special creatures made out of void, dead nor alive, genderless, and their only reason of existence is to erase the infection. And when all seems lost, out of the depths of abyss, the player will rise, the savior of Hallownest. The first thing you will probably learn in this game are the controls and the combat. The controls are very responsive, they feel good, and the jump feels very different than, let's say, in Super Metroid, where Samus kinda fucks off any presence of gravity for a split second. In this game, going vertically and horizontally is both very important, and the player can control the height of the jump by pressing the jump button for a low jump or holding it for a higher jump. The player can also look up or down to see what's above or beneath. These aren't, of course, the only controls, and the moveset of your movement expands by time. You can get the dash ability very early, and then later your dash can go through enemies, similar to a smoke bomb power-up in Cuphead. But it's different and it isn't overpowered because it needs a second or two to recharge, so it can be spammed and it makes for some very close calls. You also have the wall jump, which, well, helps you jump off of walls, or just a wall. The double jump, which is very useful in the combat, just like the dash, and can help when the player is falling down to the ground. Ismasteer lets you not get hurt by acid. You have this ground pound attack that does damage and breaks some floors in some places and helps you find secrets. And the last one is the crystal dash, that is pretty much a dash that doesn't stop unless the player voluntarily stops it, which is different than the normal dash, or if the player hits an obstacle or an enemy, and it's mainly used for covering huge distances. The game makes you use every of these upgrades for their intended purpose and more. And the game does backtrack you, but it gives you the path you immediately have to go after getting the upgrade. And if you don't have the upgrade, the whole map is connected, and with the segues, you can get to the location you want in no time. The game doesn't want to waste your time. It's surprising how many amount of areas every of these abilities unlocks. The game even learns the player not only with the simple text how and in which situations to use these abilities, but you also have like these little crystals on walls indicating to use the crystal dash. Also, getting on the ground or hitting anything resets your dash and double jump, which is very helpful. If the movement in this game is the butter, the combat is definitely the bread. In the beginning, you have no other means of inflicting damage except your nail, aka sword. You can swing your nail in 4 directions, up, down, left, or right, and also every swing you make makes you and your enemy move. So being on small platforms and fighting is very tricky. Slashing your nail down is very useful because you can hit enemies that are beneath you or are moving directly towards you. You can also interact with the environment slashing your nail down as well, like these bouncy mushrooms in the fungal wastes or using the centipedes in deepness. The player has to adapt to the enemies and learn their attack patterns, and the game rewards skill and timing immensely. You can also upgrade your nail, and with every upgrade you deal more and more damage. You also have these special moves with your nail called the nail arts, which you can charge and then release, doing a huge amount of damage. Later, you get this dream nail, which is a different kind of nail that lets you talk to the deceased, and it also lets you read someone else's thoughts, which is very useful if you want to explore more of the lore. You can also get soul from it, and it also teleports you just because Team Cherry said why not. Very early in the game, you get this ranged attack that uses your soul from the soul meter a bit. Speaking of soul, soul is absolutely vital. It makes every fight in this game a situation of kill or be killed, and it makes everything so more dynamic because you will mainly get soul from hitting the enemies or hitting these statues you sometimes find. You can also get it from your dream nail as well, and this charm, but these aren't as good or as consistent as just hitting an enemy straight in the noggin. Like 5 notch costs for this thing? It will be a cold day in hell before I use this crap. You use your soul mainly for healing because besides benches which save your progress and update your map, there is no means of getting your health back except soul and like 1 charm that you get very late in the game. You can spend your soul also on doing a butt ton of damage or to heal yourself, and you will have to learn how to manage your soul, especially in boss fights. Later, you can upgrade your soul container to have more soul, and you can also find more of like these mask shards that after getting 4 of them, they act like heart containers in Legend of Zelda. This soul system reminds me of the Spider-Man game from PlayStation 4, which also works in a similar fashion, where you can heal by doing damage or you can do an attack that kills the enemy instantly. Except your ranged soul attack that is good for dealing damage to the enemies that use shields or enemies that are far away. You also have the ground pound, which I talked about, and this abyss shriek that you use for enemies that are above you, or mainly dream bosses, that is enemies which don't guard their bottom part. If you aren't careful enough, you will just die, and when you die, you lose all your Geo, which is a currency in Hollow Nest, and you actually have to go beat your Shade, which will wait for you in the place where you last died. And it will imitate the abilities the player received during the game, and it will take more hits the more masks the player gets. And you will die a lot, especially against bosses. Like, a lot. Hollow Knight isn't like Sekiro or Dark Souls levels of hard. I would say it's easier than Cuphead just a little bit, but the bosses are what brings difficulty to this game. And some are hard like the Radiants, and some bosses are just fruit hard. Speaking of bosses, in this game they are freaking sick and they are so much fun. There are two main categories for bosses. You have your normal standard bosses and you have dream bosses, which are less fun and less hard except for like Galen, the Lost Kin, and White Defender, which are actually fun, and Markov, who is a massive asshole and is hard for no reason. The dream bosses are there to give you essence, which you will need later to get the true ending. Some bosses look like bosses, like the Fluke Marm, but they are more like mini bosses. Every boss is different and has a different moveset and a way to beat them. Some bosses just don't give a shit and stand like the Fluke Marm, and some bosses value movement, like the Umo boss fight, in which you will have to jump and dash all over the place. Some bosses are there for the lore, like the previously said Umo or Traitor Lord boss fight. There are only maybe two bosses I played and haven't found fun, Marmu and the Soul. Marmu just kinda is boring, and you hit her, and that's it. It's boring. You use one button for the whole fight. Like come on, look at this. But the Soul Tyrant is so insanely different than any other boss in this game. The fight feels so slow and it feels like you are not making any progress. And it's just so insanely hard to hit him because he teleports everywhere. This is especially different when you look that all other bosses are dynamic. They are fun. Like, look how many things are happening at the screen here. It just looks amusing. Some bosses are indirectly hard because you are fighting one creature, like the Lost Kin. I think that fight is hard because these orange blobby things spawn at a very fast rate and they kinda blend with the environment, so it's hard to spot them. Some bosses have more phases than a teenager, like the Radiance, which also has butt ton of different moves. My least favorite are these orbs that follow you around and they are just the biggest pain in the ass. The Radiance clearly has different attacks and phases in the beginning. She just is kinda there and then she spawns these spikes. Now you fight her on platforms, yada yada, it's different. The bosses are so different. Every boss makes it fair for the player because he can heal during some attacks or after dealing a certain amount of damage, in which the bosses will enter this kind of staggered state. Also, for some bosses, certain charm belts work better than others. Charms are these like badges with their own abilities, and every charm has a notch cost. This charm, for example, makes your dash shadow do damage. This one heals faster, and so forth and so on. Some charms make combinations with each other, like the Boulder Shell in the shape of Van, or the Fluke Nest and the Defender's Crest. Some charms make some areas so much easier, like the Hive Blood making White Palace a bit less of a hell than it is. I found that the Nail Extending charms, the faster Soul Healing charm, and the Sharp Shadow, along with the charm that powers up your soul attacks, are the most useful. The charms can only be changed when the player is on a bench, and they can be found anywhere on the map, especially in secret regions, and it's a pretty neat reward the game gives you. And you can even get some charms after beating some bosses, like after beating the Mantis Lords. And oh, the Mantis Lords. The Mantis Lords are probably my favorite boss fight because it's so dynamic and has so many things happening in it. Like, look, it's crazy, it demands your full concentration, and it balances challenge and fun, the movement and the combat. You can only hit them while they're attacking, and you have to be quick, but careful as well. And they will give you a little bit of breathing space in which you can heal when they get on walls, and even then they attack you. And that's what the game does very well, balancing between challenge and fun, the story and the combat, the exploration and the progression. I think the perfect example of this are the last two boss fights in the game. At first you will battle Hollow Knight. The battle is not so hard, but it doesn't need to be, because it isn't the last fight. It needs to be fun, because the player will play it so many times just because the Radiance battle is so hard. I played the Hollow Knight battle at least 100 times, and it was never boring to me. Hollow Knight is just a gateway to the Radiance boss fight, which is super hard, and is the very last boss fight. Everything the game does is all so neatly packed and so well done, and that's what makes this game great, although it isn't without the flaws. But as a consumer, from a business standpoint, Hollow Knight is a 10 out of 10. At just $15,
Hollow Knight does so much and so many things right that even some games that cost $60 can't do.
Hollow Knight may be hard, but it's pretty easy on your wallet. It hurts me to talk bad things about the game because it's $15. It's easy to talk shit about Assassin's Creed or The Last of Us 2, but you really have to make it hard on yourself to disrespect this masterpiece. But speaking of that, no game is perfect, and there are some minor things that I think could have been different. I think the game developers could have left you at least with one ability, or at least with a spell to make the first 3 hours or so more fun and dynamic. But this lack of abilities also makes the player seem frail and vulnerable, because your moveset is so limited, so you kinda lose the one with the other. I also think the pacing of when you get some abilities is super awkward. Like for some solid 20 hours, I only had the dash and the wall jump, and after getting the third ability, you get every ability in a span of 3 hours, and you have nothing more to unlock but so many places left to explore. Also, I think the Desolate Dive is kinda useless, at least for the combat part of the ability, and I used it 0 times at boss fights. But even with all of these minor nuisances I have with the game does so many things well, and if you maybe don't like the gameplay for the first 2 hours, you will still play the game because of the mysterious and interesting world the game brings upon you. At least this was the case for me. I really didn't think the game was gonna pack a punch, maybe until the first boss fight, but I continued playing it because I loved the aesthetic and the thought of this bug world so cruel but yet so beautiful. It's literally like Bug's Life on meth. Only when I got to the first Hornet fight I realized how fun the game is and that I was gonna have a good time, and I am glad that I continued playing it, and I am happy the game captured me with the beautiful yet harsh world of Hallownest. Speaking of Hallownest, Hallownest is a carefully and well-constructed map, with every area connecting with another. Every area differentiates from the other. The City of Tears is the capital, and you see these buildings and the statues that were built at the peak of the kingdom's power. Its residents have grown pathetically weak because of glamour and luxury they lived in. It makes the player use these neat lifts, and the enemies later use teleportation. You have the crystal mines, which are, well, the mines, and have these tracks and platforms that turn into spikes when you are too long on them, and they have these little nasty guys that throw crystals at you, and it makes the surface deal damage to you, and, well, they really freaking suck. With this, not every run of Hollow Knight is the same, and you can get to some parts much more earlier or later than you should, but it's still fun because exploring it, getting to a whole nother place is magical and has a certain charm to it. Every single area in the game has a specific tone to it, specific music, and specific enemies. Deepnest is this dark, underground, and unexplored place of the kingdom, with no light but with darkness everywhere. In some places, it doesn't even have music. It's very dense, dark, and it keeps you on your toes because some enemies even come back to life and come out of nowhere. It's obscenely different than, let's say, Greenpath, a place full of life. It's more dynamic, filled with greenery, and enemies that test your platforming and combat very early in the game. The Earthmount is your classic safe area with a bench that heals you and saves your game, shops where you buy charms or markers for the map, a stagway which lets you quick travel, Fungal Waste has a main area and a sub-area. The enemies here mainly use gas attacks. The Mantis is also reside here, which may prove hard for many new players. You also have the Queen's Gardens, which use these platforms that disappear when you are too long on them. Royal Waterways is a sewer system that is very linear and a maze-like, and it has these things too. The Howling Cliffs are an area you can get to very early or super late when you get every stag station, where you will be surprised that you are all the way back from the beginning of the game. Some areas are very small and linear to some other ones, like the Abyss and Ancient Basin. Some areas are just secrets like the Hive and can be missed completely if the player isn't careful enough. The Hive also has these bees that turn into freaking drills. And it also gives you a charm that helps you so much in the White Palace, a place where the Pale King resided, made to test the player's platforming skills. The game always rewards the player, and the player always has to work to get something. The game won't even give you a normal map. You will actually have to buy a charm to see where you are on the map. Every area is different, having different enemies, buildings, platforming stages, but they have some things in common, like the map. The map is one of the most important tools in the game. The map is pretty much your second pair of eyes, and after getting into a new area, your priority is to find Cornifer every single time. Cornifer is an NPC you will encounter the most, and he sells the maps for all areas. He already draws a bit of the area, but never the full area, and he always lets the player explore to the fullest. Cornifer also leaves pieces of paper on the ground and hums so the player can find them more easily. Every area also has a stagway station, which is a form of quick travel, so you don't have to walk to the same place every time. All areas have secrets, and the game heavily rewards the player for exploring or remembering that some places exist, even if the player can get to them because the player had the lack of ability to get there. A good example of this is Gigi, an NPC that feeds off rancid eggs that you will find if you explore an area thoroughly, and as a reward she will spawn your shade if it's in a very tough spot to get to so you don't lose all your geo. And when the areas become accessible, usually the player finds a way to make a door open or break these with supports that construct a shortcut, so backtracking won't be such a pain. Sometimes the game shows you these breakable walls or the rustling ground, implying that it can be broken. Most secrets will just be a grub that the game rewards the player when finding all of them, and it even makes this interesting with the enemies that imitate grubs that are very hostile and attack the player instantly, sort of like the piano in Mario 64. Most of the places in the game are closed because the player doesn't have the right ability to get there or doesn't have the right item, for example the Lumafly lantern that you buy with Geo that helps you see in the dark. Some areas even change in appearance the more the player progresses, like the Forgotten Crossroads becoming the Infected Crossroads, and the enemies and the appearance of the crossroads becomes different. Now you have these crazy kamikaze bugs that explode, and these bigger versions of flying enemies that explode when killed. The player also encounters many awesome characters. Zod is a knight wannabe, but acts like he's the biggest warrior in Halonest, even though he's pathetic in combat. Mela is a normal everyday worker, and you can see the infection growing until she also fully succumbs to it. Cloth is a bug that's brave and wants to test her skills to the limit. Every character brings something to the table, even the Hollow Knight. The Hollow Knight fight is so dramatic and emotional because the Radiance clearly controls him against the Hollow Knight's will, and he even stabs himself in a hope to get through to the Radiance, and everything is topped off with the beautiful and amazing music.
The music in this game slaps better than a belt and an ass, and it's so good. It makes the atmosphere of certain areas. It makes them eerie or full of life. I particularly like the use of bowed string instruments, and they just pop off in some places like the Soul Sanctum. Even though it's mainly instrumental, some music uses the human voice, like the City of Tears theme, and I really think it makes the ambience of Halonest that much better. Hollow Knight does so many things well that even the minor flaws it has doesn't affect the game, because the game captures the player with its setting immediately, and it's imperfectly perfect, and definitely an indie game masterpiece.